The student got off the bus and disappeared without a trace, and the next day her body was found in a field. The police spent 39 years searching for the culprit, and only in 2019 did modern technology make it possible to find out the truth. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Helen Prashinsky. Helen Prashinsky was born on April 6, 1958 in the city of Huntington, which was located near New York. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old respectively. The girl grew up in love and care. She got along well with older relatives and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14 years old, her father received a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton, located near Boston. There she entered a local school, where she became interested in singing and sports. At the same time, Helen decided that she wanted to connect her future life with journalism. After school, she entered Eton College, located 110 kilometers from her city. It was close enough to visit his family regularly. In addition, this educational institution offered truly high-quality education in the field of journalism. Helen quickly adapted to student life, studied excellently, and took an active part in the life of the college. Eventually, she had an opportunity that she was looking forward to. She had to go to practice in the news department of a radio station located in Denver. Despite the fact that this city was more than 3,000 kilometers from her college, Helen was delighted with this opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to shelter the girl during her internship. A classmate who studied journalism also went with her. In January 1980, Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at the radio station. Every day she had to travel from office to home by bus. The journey took approximately 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several kilometers. On January 16, as usual, she left the radio station at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. But she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry, since Helen had always warned her before if she planned to stay somewhere. The woman waited for several hours, but at 11:30 she finally decided to contact the police. Investigators immediately began searching, fearing her disappearance could be linked to a recent spate of attacks on women in the area. They searched the area along Helen's route all night, but were unable to find her. This morning a woman contacted the police. She was driving through the Denver suburbs with her children. At some point, they noticed that someone was lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped the car, came closer, and saw the body of a young girl without signs of life. The police who arrived at the scene immediately identified Helen. She was partially missing clothes, and her hands were tied behind her back. All her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girls were stabbed 9 times and were also subjected to violence. Death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. The police were able to find a witness who saw Helen getting off the bus at about 5:30. From the stop, she had to walk several kilometers, and apparently, the criminal attacked her precisely on this part of the route. Law enforcement searched the area near where the body was found, but were unable to find almost any leads other than footprints from supposedly size 44 boots that led from the road to the body and back. By that time, medical experts had discovered biological material on the victim's body and clothing that apparently belonged to the killer. But in those years, this could not help the investigation in any way, since the science in the field of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development. But these samples were sent to the laboratory for storage, hoping that in the future they would help identify the criminal. Police appealed to the public for information using newspapers and local television. They were trying to find a witness who might have seen Helen that evening. Soon they were contacted by a woman who, at approximately 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to the car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman was unable to see this man in detail. She gave the police only general outlines that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step. With the consent of the witness, they invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which she was able to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is difficult to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time the police had nothing but this drawing. However, they were never able to find a single suspect, and the case went cold for years. 6 months later, Helen posthumously received her college diploma as a sign of remembrance. In addition, the leadership of the educational institution established an award for graduates named in her honor. This award was given for active participation in the life of the college, which was inherent in Helen throughout her studies. The investigation was resumed only in 1998, 18 years after the murder. By that time, technologies in the field of DNA research had progressed significantly, and researchers entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the offender had not previously been prosecuted, at least not since DNA samples began to be taken from convicts. Another 15 years passed. In 2013, the local police department created a unit that was supposed to deal with unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but found no new leads. A DNA sample from the victim's body never appeared in the FBI database. This meant that the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police all this time for other possible crimes. Over all these years, not only the police and Helen's relatives tried to find the truth. The girl's school friends, with whom she was in the choir, took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to regularly review the case. They also gave interviews to bring the story to the public, and distributed leaflets about Helen's murders along her bus route. The case was reopened in 2017, and this time detectives had much more options. By this time, forensic science began to actively use genetic genealogy, with the help of which the identity of a criminal could be calculated through his relatives. Of course, it was a very difficult and protracted process. In addition, this method only worked if the relatives of the DNA owner were in a common accessible genetic database. There are several of these, and they are mainly used to search for family members. In 2018, the police transferred the available DNA samples to the Parabon Laboratory, which has already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts had to study about 3,000 matches, among which were even the most distant relatives of the alleged killer. Next, we had to weed out those who were not suitable in age, or could not commit this crime for other reasons. Ultimately, experts determined that the owner of the DNA was most likely the son of a woman named June Estes, who was no longer alive at that time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the laboratory could only identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old at the time of the murder, so they were immediately excluded. The search for the other 2 sons dragged on, and experts began to explore other options. Another year passed when suddenly something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie entered her DNA sample into a public database, which was the main tool for finding criminals. Experts from Parabon immediately saw that Jessie was a fairly close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. After a more detailed study of DNA, experts determined that the killer was Jessie's second cousin. Detectives asked the woman to provide information about her family in order to finally identify the suspect. Luckily for them, Jessie was interested in podcasts about various crimes, like Helen's murder. It is for this reason that she entered her data into an open database, because with the help of genetic genealogy, you can find a person even through the most distant relatives. And Jessie understood that with her decision, she could help solve some case. However, she could not even imagine that this would happen immediately after loading her data into the database. The woman began collecting information about her ancestry, and also asked both parents to add their DNA to the database. Thanks to this, experts from Parabon established that the killer is related to Jessie on his father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer dragged on for several more months. Experts, detectives, and Jesse's family worked together to get closer to the DNA from the murder scene. And soon it finally happened. The police managed to contact a relative of June Estes, and he told new details about her eldest sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, the father took the boys and took them to another city. Their names were William and Cortez, and the detectives had to find out which of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The police immediately discovered that William had been in prison several times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Considering that the sample from Helen's body had been run through this base many times since then, William was not the killer. The disadvantage of this database is that it only shows a complete match, but not a partial match, even if we are talking about brothers. As a result, 39 years after the murder, police had a prime suspect, Cortez White, who also used the surname Clanton. It turned out that this man also had a rich criminal history behind him. At 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside the house, he pulled out a knife and assaulted the victim before running away. He was quickly caught and imprisoned for 30 years. It's just that he was released after 4 years. He was released early because an employee of a Christian institution for troubled teenagers, where Cortez managed to visit before he came of age, stood up for him for stealing a core. This man said that he was ready to shelter the criminal in his home and find him a job. It's hard to imagine how you can bring a convicted criminal into your home where your wife and 5 children are. But this man asked the court to release Cortez under exactly these conditions. Upon his release, Cortez moved in with him and got a job as a gardener. At the time of Helen's murder, he was living in that area. Later he moved to Florida, where detectives went in 2019. Cortez was 62 years old at that time. He worked as a truck driver. Investigators wanted more evidence before charging him with Helen's murder. They observed the man for about a week in an attempt to secretly obtain a sample of his DNA. First, they removed a milk carton from his trash container and sent it to the laboratory. Experts found someone's DNA on it, but it was too little for analysis. Detectives then followed him to a bar, where the suspect drank several beers from the same glass. As soon as he left, the glass was seized and sent to a laboratory in Colorado. Transportation and study took almost a month, but ultimately the detectives had the long-awaited result in their hands. The sample from the victim's body completely matched Cortez's DNA. He was arrested on December 11 and charged with Helen's murder. The man denied any involvement in the case, so the prosecutor prepared to take the case to trial, and the man himself was extradited to Colorado. And then something unexpected happened. On the way there, he gradually began to confess to what he had done. The detectives who accompanied him listened to all the details of the crime committed. Cortez said that he was driving down the street and noticed a lonely girl who got off the bus. Taking out a knife, he forced her to get into his car with the aim of committing violent acts, after which he took her out of town, abused her, and killed her. As a result, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Considering that by that time he will be 82 years old, the criminal may well not live to see this day. Unfortunately, most of Helen's relatives also did not wait for the moment when the killer was punished. Her parents and older brother had passed away many years before, leaving only her older sister alive. Almost 40 years later, an elderly woman received a call from the police station, who finally informed her that the case had been solved.